Okay, world history students. Today we're going to play the story in China forward a little bit by looking at the period in Chinese history that follows what I talked about before, which was peak imperial China. China at its most grand, at its most uh, desirable from the perspective of the outside world. China was known as the most powerful civilization in the world. It was the civilization that Europeans wanted to get to trade, to get exotic, valuable products that they couldn't get anywhere else. So I want us to keep that in our frame of mind as we look at the China that begins to develop during the 1800s. Until about the year 1800 CE, China is by far and away the most powerful civilization that makes the best products. It's almost entirely self-sufficient. It doesn't need the rest of the world. Yes, some European traders do get to China prior to 1800, but when they get there, they're largely confined to the coast. The Chinese government really wants nothing to do with them. What we're going to see here is what changes after the year 1800. And this begins a period of what is known as European imperialism. Just like we saw European imperialism in South Asia and India and Africa and Latin America, it's going to kind of work its way into China, but in some different forms. It's also going to bring about a conflict which is known as the Opium Wars, one of the world's first drug wars, you might say. So there's two slides of text here, and I'm putting it all out here, and I'll walk you through it. So European trade had been growing in networks into the late 1700s. I mean, this is the era when Britain had colonized much of India, when it's trading through much of Latin America. The Sugar Islands, the American colonies were a thing. The Dutch were setting up spice islands in the East Indies, and the Portuguese, the French, the fur trade. All of that had been happening. But they really hadn't been, I mean the Europeans, they hadn't been successful in breaking into China. There's been some limited trade, but by about the year 1800, Europeans are still very confined. And in many cases, they're losing money when they get to China because China doesn't want their stuff. All they're interested in is European gold and silver. It's the only sort of currency that talks. So they want to break into Chinese market because there are very desirable products, expensive products like silks and teas and porcelain. And as I said, China wants little really in return. There aren't a whole lot of European products that the Chinese are interested in. The Qing dynasty is the prevailing government at the time in China, and it's very powerful, although it's beginning to show signs of decline. There's internal corruption, there are a number of rebellions that had kind of weakened their control. And at this same time, around the year 1800, this is when the Industrial Revolution is taking off in Europe. And I mentioned this in the previous lecture. Europe is taking off in terms of its technological power, just as this great civilization of China under the Qing dynasty is beginning to decline. Keep those two things in mind. China, as I said before, had tightly regulated its trade. It does not allow European merchants and business people to go into the interior of China and trade with what they want. If you're a British, a Dutch, a French, or whoever trader, you are confined to some southern port cities. That's it. The port city of Canton, which is going to be the forerunner for Hong Kong later in the future. So this brings about a period in this European contact with China known as the Opium Wars. And it's kind of the example we would point to show European imperialism in action when it comes to China, the Opium Wars, that is. So Britain is faced with this very difficult problem. How do we find stuff that the Chinese want? They don't want our stuff. They're a powerful civilization. They have the best stuff already. What can we trade to them? They finally solve this problem. Britain finds an addictive drug, opium, which it is successfully able to produce with their poppy fields in India. This is one of the benefits of having an empire, is you can kind of cultivate and build up products from throughout your empire, and eventually you might stumble upon something that's profitable. On the back burner, they of course have sugar and cotton and some other really profitable things, tobacco and the like. The Chinese government recognizes that this is a threat because rich Chinese people, or anybody with money, when they become addicted to opium, are going to want to buy it. And it's going to start draining the silver and gold reserves of the Qing dynasty in China. Essentially, large chunks of the population are getting addicted to opium in China. This is great for the British because they've finally cracked the code of what the Chinese want. It's bad for the Chinese because they're seeing their nation turn into a nation of addicts who are, suffering from all the side effects of opium addiction, which is not being able to be productive workers and death and willing to sell all your possessions to feed the addiction. So the Chinese government does what many governments would do in the face of a drug crisis. They ban the substance. They ban British traders from trading opium. They actually will say British opium ships have to stay out of China. Britain doesn't like this because essentially it's cutting in on what would be the equivalent of a multi-billion-dollar trade, and they retaliate by the Chinese government by sinking British ships. This is a huge no-no. It's an aggressive, violent trade war from the British perspective, and they see it as an act of war. So this happens in the 1830s and 40s, the late 1830s, early 1840s. The Chinese sink a bunch of British ships. The British show up with new ships, only these are steam-powered ships because it's the Industrial Revolution, and they begin to open up fire on Chinese port cities and essentially demonstrate the power of the Industrial Revolution. They force their way into China. China loses this opium war. There's another round of this fought in the 1850s, and eventually the Qing dynasty, the Chinese government, has to bow to the British demands, which is, let us trade drugs in your city. China's forced to open its coastal ports to British opium drug traders. It's humiliatingly forced to accept Britain's trade demands. It creates a bunch of demands, Britain that is, that the Chinese government lets British traders be tried in British courts. So even if you have a business person or a merchant violating Chinese laws, they have to, they're not subject to Chinese laws. They also have to let British traders move into the interior of the country and sell opium as well. And it's seen as a big humiliation for China, even though on paper, China is still an independent nation. Britain uses steamships and artillery. This is an example of not only imperialism going on, but it's an example of the Industrial Revolution showing its effects. It's showing what happens when one nation gets steam and artillery and all the benefits of industrialization versus a nation that hadn't quite developed that as much as in the case of China. And you see this cartoon off to the side here. This is a cartoon from the late 1800s actually, but it's showing how Europeans, through these different caricatures, are dividing up China. The Chinese symbolized by the Qing dynasty official in the background throwing up his hands in surprise. Meanwhile, you have the other European caricatures, Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm, the Russian Tsar, even the Japanese are represented. The United States, Lady Liberty is looking on. And it's shown how China is kind of thrown at the mercy of the European powers. As I said, the purpose of this lesson is to show you what does imperialism look like in China when the Europeans show up in a big way. Let's look at this map here just to give you a vision that it's not just the British, but there are other nations engaging in sort of the carving up of China. You see the British in green, but you also have the French moving in the south, French Indochina, which would be modern-day countries of like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. They're going to have an impact. The Russians are going to take a greater role in the north. Even the Japanese are going to begin to assert their dominance and influence by the time you get to the early 20th century. The Germans are going to have trading outposts. Eventually the Americans are going to intervene in a big way with the Philippines. So China still retains its identity. There's still a Qing dynasty. China's still a country, but it's losing the ability to control its economy and its politics, and foreign governments are beginning to kind of strangle away its decision making. You see this kind of here. This is by the year 1900, after you've had almost a century of European influence, what European nations and where they exert their influence. This is kind of a picture of an Chinese opium den. It was taken of a man who's addicted to opium at the time, and it was known as making you very lethargic and not productive, and you're willing to sell your possessions to feed the drug habit. You see opium imports into China. By the time you get to the 1860s and 1880s, you have large volumes of opiums pouring into Chinese port cities. I want to look at a couple of image documents here. Nothing you have to do with this, but just look at them. It's going to inform your ability to respond to the open-ended question later in the week. This is a cartoon from the time. You have a stereotypical British admiral trader pouring opium down the throat of the stereotypical individual from the Qing dynasty who's wearing his queue, that his hair being styled in that braided queue. That was a sign of basically Qing dynasty gentlemen at the time. You see China being essentially subdued by the animal symbols of other European nations. Britain is stereotypically the lion. Russia is the bear. You see others involved there. The eagle, the United States off to the side. There's a little label for the leopard in Japan. And China is this dragon that's been subdued. And from the perspective of the Europeans, the dragon was the most powerful mythical creature, just like China had been the most powerful civilization. But by the time you get to the year 1900, it looks as though this great civilization of China had been brought to its knees. I want to read you this. This is a primary source. It's from the autobiography of a Chinese working woman that was printed in the 1960s. This is her description of what opium did to her family. Opium, that drug that the British had gotten many Chinese addicted to. My husband sold everything we had. There was a fur hat. He wanted to sell it, but I begged him not to sell it. Let's keep this. It was my uncle's. Take my coat. He took the coat and sold it for grain. When he came home for food, he drank only 2 bowls of millet gruel. I wondered why he ate so little. I looked and found that his hat was gone, and I knew that he had sold it for opium. Those who take opium care not for food. This is, of course, a little window on just how opium affects one family. Imagine that magnified over hundreds of thousands, millions of people in Chinese port cities and elsewhere. I want to read you this other one here. This is a primary source, but this isn't just an ordinary working person. This is the letter Lin Se-tu to Queen Victoria, monarch of Great Britain, head of the British Empire. And this is in 1839 at the outbreak of the Opium War. Lin Se-tu is writing to Queen Victoria, kind of trying to alert her to the devastating effects of the opium trade. This is what he says. During the commercial trade which has existed so long between us, among the numerous foreign merchants, are some who by means of introducing opium by stealth, meaning secret, have seduced our Chinese people and caused every province of the land to overflow with that poison, referring to the opium. These, then, seek only to advantage themselves. They care not about injuring others, referring to the merchants. Every native of the inner land who sells opium, as also all who smoke it, are alike sentenced to death. Were we then to go back and take up the crimes of the foreigners, who by selling it for many years have induced dreadful calamity and robbed us of enormous wealth, and punish them with equal severity, our laws could not but award to them absolute annihilation. We have heard it said that in your own country, opium is prohibited. He's saying this to Queen Victoria in a letter. With the utmost strictness and severity, opium is banned in Great Britain. This is strong proof that you know full well how hurtful it is to mankind. Since then you do not permit to injure your own country, you ought not to have the harmful drug transferred to another country. Opium is an extremely devastating drug, and this is being known and talked about at the highest levels of government. The story is that Queen Victoria never responds to this letter. Who really knows if she read it? But the fact that it existed is really remarkable and shows you just the length Britain was willing to go to find a profitable substance to break into Chinese markets. So here's your task. You've listened to this screencast. I have one other thing for you to do. I'd like you to watch this Edpuzzle clip that's going to be linked in the It's Learning plan for today. And again, your task is just simply to take notes and use these materials to help answer an open-ended question at the end of the week.